Deficit is likely to come in just shy of $1 trillion in 2019, latest Treasury figures show. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about the budget deficit. It's getting really, really large. It's already in the first 10 months of 2019 fiscal year, which ends on September 30th, at $866.8 billion. This is much larger than it was last year. If you look at the budget deficits going back several years, what you'll see is that the last time we hit $1 trillion deficit was in 2012. After 2011, we had a budget sequestration that was put into effect after congressional Republicans came to a compromise with former President Barack Obama. And as a result, you were able to reduce the budget deficit. Now, revenues took a huge hit after the financial crisis and during the Great Recession. Spending increased much, much greater. And as a result of the sequestration, we were able to get the budget deficit down at its best in 2015, down to $441 billion. Now, this was by freezing defense and non-defense discretionary spending. It really didn't affect Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, food stamps, things like that, which are set in law on the basis of eligibility, such that when you have a partial government shutdown, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of that continues to be spent. All those monies continue to be spent because they are not subject to annual appropriations by Congress. And so we're once again projecting $1 trillion deficits going forward. And I think we'll come just shy of that in 2019 fiscal year. And that has to do, I think, with mostly spending because the revenues are rising. If you look at those numbers on from the U.S. Treasury, which is what we're talking about here, the first 10 months of the fiscal year, receipts come in at $2.86 trillion. Now, that's actually up from last year, where you see that it was at $2.77 trillion. Now, spending, on the other hand, has increased dramatically. It's gone from, in the first 10 months of the fiscal year, from $3.4 trillion all the way up to $3.7 trillion. So it went from 3.45 to 3.72. That's almost a $300 billion increase in spending. In the meantime, although tax revenues are increasing as the economy is doing okay, it's not increasing nearly enough to keep up with the spending. And so as a result, we're projecting much greater growth in the national debt in the coming years. So right now, the national debt is at $22.3 trillion. That includes $16.4 trillion of debt held by the public, financial institutions, central banks, that's those sorts of things. And then $5.9 trillion of intergovernmental holdings. Those are in the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. The way when they have surplus revenues in the trust funds from payroll taxes, what they do is they basically purchase Treasury bonds so that they earn interest. This is actually prolonging the life of the Social Security and Medicare programs. And I think that we're going to see as time goes forward, that the amount of debt held by the intergovernmental holdings is going to drop, and then that debt is going to transfer to debt held by the public as the trust funds are exhausted once they're no longer producing surpluses. And so as a result, we can project pretty strongly that the national debt is going to get much, much larger. So for when you look at the numbers, you'll note that 8.8% growth of the national debt every year since 1980. That's over the past 40 years. In the meantime, the economy has only been growing nominally at 5.4%. Now, that's not the real GDP number that's reported every year. That's inflation adjusted. This is a non-inflation adjusted number, the nominal growth. That factors into your debt to GDP ratio. We're already at 105 debt to GDP ratio. But if the debt keeps growing the way it has, if the economy were to continue growing the way it has, you would find that you have $100 trillion debt by 2037. That's a huge number. And the economy is not going to grow that fast. So even if the economy kept on growing at that rate of 5.4%, in 20 years, you would have a $55 trillion economy by 2037. But you would have a much larger national debt at $106 trillion. Now, even if the debt only grew at 7% a year, as you saw in the last year, you still wind up with $100 trillion of debt by 2041. And in the meantime, the economy is not growing that fast. It's not growing at 5.4%. It's growing at nominally. It's only growing at about 4% nominally. And so if on average, so if that were to happen by 2041, you'd have $50 trillion GDP and $100 trillion of national debt. So it's a 200% debt to GDP ratio. Doesn't sound good, does it? Well, and what does that look like? What type of economy will we have? Well, just look at Japan. Their economy has barely grown nominally in the past 20 years amid a declining population. They had a $10.5 trillion debt and just a $5.2 trillion gross domestic product. So that's a 200% debt to GDP ratio. And that's not a good place to be. I think that if that's where we want to go, this is what it's going to look like. The economy barely growing in Japan the past several years. It's just kind of frozen in place. And that's not I think ideal for where we would like to be going in the United States. And so we should try to avoid that situation, I think. But there's a lot of factors that go into why Japan is where it is. Its population has been declining since the mid 2000s. And you also, that has to do with their fertility rate, which is at 1.4. You need 2 births per woman in order to maintain your current population level. In the United States, we're on the same trajectory. Since the financial crisis, we've dipped below 2 births per woman, and it keeps on going down. So millennials are delaying marriage, they're delaying home purchases, they're not having as many children as prior generations, and that's going to have a huge impact on the growth of the working age population, which if that's not growing, you should expect the economy to probably freeze or start to contract a little bit. It's one of the major factors to consider when you're looking at economic growth. And I think that we're not going to grow as fast as we once did with such a huge debt load. And so what can be done about this? Well, Congress doesn't have much of a will to cut spending. And that has to do with the fact that they basically need 60 votes to do anything to address entitlements, one of the biggest drivers of the spending and the deficit. And so they don't want to address Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or anything like that. And so every year they argue about defense and non-defense discretionary spending. And this year they agreed to increase it. It would seem like a modest increase compared to what was going on during the sequestration years. And even with that, with the economy at full employment, with the economy doing well, you're seeing us already approach a $1 trillion deficit. So what do we suppose is going to happen to the budget deficit if we hit another recession? Well, you could see about a $2 trillion annual deficit. And that's going to play into those scenarios where the national debt is growing much, much faster than what we're already seeing right now. And it's growing pretty fast. And so President Trump, his budget is proposed about $2.7 trillion of cuts over the next 10 years, and that would bring you into balance by about 2035 or 2034. The problem is that Congress is not adopting those proposals, and so the budget projections in the OMB budget that says we're only going to have a $31.5 trillion national debt by 2029, that's most likely wrong because they're not adopting the Trump budget. So you don't get those numbers. Instead, you see spending increasing much, much faster. And so if we're going to get a control on the spending, you really need to see economic growth. If Congress is not going to do it, then the only way out of this mess to avoid becoming Japan or Europe is we need to grow the economy much, much faster. And so I tend to be optimistic. I think that things that we could do to grow the economy are starting to take place. So, and there's questions you have to ask about where we're going to be. Will we still be the dollar? Still be the world's reserve currency? Will the dollar remain strong relative to other currencies? Will there be such strong demand for U.S. Treasuries on global financial markets, one of the biggest drivers of debt? Will we still be running $870 billion plus trade deficits on an annual basis? Will we experience another baby boom? If we get another baby boom, then you could see the working age populations eventually growing much faster, and then you could see more robust economic growth. So we see scenarios where we can see economic growth, but it's going to require bringing production back to the United States from overseas. You get a baby boom, trade deficits are reduced, and then more money is invested in the United States instead of overseas. And that's certainly the economic vision President Trump laid out in 2016. So there is leadership that wants to move in that direction. But is Congress going to help out? I think we're about to find out. And so I'll leave you with the closing here. I think we might hit $1 trillion deficit in 2020. And again, it's not because of tax cuts, it's because spending is increasing far too much, and Congress plays the role in spending. And if we're not going to get spending under control, then we need to do more to bring production back to the United States and grow the economy here. Don't let the dollar be so strong relative to other currencies. We can grow the economy here in the United States, and I think everyone will benefit from that. So here's the closing. Again, nothing is set in stone. I tend to think optimistically about the future because I do not think running perpetual trade deficits like we have been and outsourcing production and jobs was ever going to be sustainable. So if the American people hadn't voted for President Donald Trump in 2016, they probably would have had to invent him. Eventually, policymakers were going to figure out that we could grow the economy here, need to grow the economy here, and we'd all be better off for it. Revenues would grow, and then nobody would be worried about the national debt. And maybe that Trump, whether he wins or loses his re-election bid in 2020, has already set us on that path. I certainly hope so, because the economy needs to grow, because the debt is going to grow much faster if we don't. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.